Thanks, Ruth, and thanks to Peter and Ruth for organizing this series. I'm just going to share my screen here quickly. There we are. Okay, a quick content note. I will touch very briefly on the residential school graves of children and the exhibitions known as human zoos. So there are some images of the human zoos coming. So on July 1st, 2021, in response to the recent discovery of and recognition of children's unmarked graves at the sites of former residential schools across Canada, a commemorative walk was held in Winnipeg that ended on the grounds of the Manitoba Legislative Building. A group of people in attendance that day then pulled down statues of Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth on those same grounds as a response to the ongoing legacies of colonialism here in Manitoba. Belinda Vanden Broek, who is a residential school survivor that was present that day, shared the following comments on the toppled statues. She said, quote, "This queen is the one that gave our land away just like that to her merry gentlemen, to her fur traders. So I really have no place for her in my heart. I never did. She means nothing to me except that her policies and her colonialism is what is dictating us right to this minute as you and I speak." So in doing so, Ms. Vanden Broek offered a very clear narrative of what those two statues commemorated for her and what they meant to her in that moment. But then 7 days later, the then Premier of Manitoba, Brian Pallister, stepped forward to address the events of Canada Day. And he was effectively admonishing those who had brought down the statues. So I'm going to share a very abridged portion of his comments in the interest of time, but I certainly encourage you to look at the full comment in context. So he said, quote, "Throughout our country's history, well before we were acknowledged as a country, we were a home of hope to people from around the world who came from long distances away to pursue a better life for themselves, for their families. And we continue to be that beacon of light for people from around the world. We must be that beacon of light for our Indigenous people in this country as well. For too long, that has not been the case. The people who came here to this country, before it was a country and since, didn't come here to destroy anything. They came here to build. They came to build better, to build they did. And they built farms, and they built businesses, and they built communities and churches too. And they built these things for themselves and for one another, and they built them with dedication and pride." So in these comments, what we see from Brian Pallister is obviously a very different perspective on what the statues of those queens commemorated. But what we also see is adherence to a very different narrative to the one that Ms. Vanden Broek puts forward in her comments. And it's really this difference that I want to interrogate, because Mr. Pallister's narrative is one that is reinforced by the very building he went to work in for so many years. The classicizing architecture of the Manitoba Legislative Assembly, but especially the sculptures on the exterior of the building, tell a story of this province's history that glorifies the role of European settlers while erasing the contributions and experiences of Indigenous people, as well as other groups who have settled in Manitoba. So let's take a closer look at the building itself, its history, and the narrative that it tells to understand how intimately every aspect of it is tied up in imperialism and colonialism, and how classical references are used in service of the misleading narrative that I've just mentioned. So here we have the front page of the Winnipeg Evening Tribune from July 17th, 1920, on the day that the legislative building was dedicated. So this was a building built between 1913 until about 1919 that replaced the Second Legislative Assembly, which stood on the grounds of the current building to its northeast. And so if we look at the headlines on this page, we see things like "Fame of Manitoba's new capital spreads to all art lovers in the world. Building is declared among greatest of its kind in North America. A $9 million capital for a birthday present." And I want you to hang on to that $9 million number, because we're going to see how over budget the building was shortly. So the building itself was designed by Frank Worthington Simon and Henry Boddington III. They're two architects from Liverpool who had won a competition that was set up by the Manitoba government in 1911. It was 4 architects who were subjects of the British Empire, and the judge was the head of a British architectural association. And the prize was $10,000, and a $100,000 commission was at stake. So that's a lot in 1911 dollars. The budget was intended to be $2 million. So we can see how much it went over, and 67 entries were submitted. The two architects, Simon and Boddington, had just begun working together in Liverpool the year prior. but they both came to Winnipeg to supervise the construction of the building. So Simon apparently was commuting between Liverpool and Winnipeg at first, and we can imagine that's quite a commute at that time. But Boddington moved permanently to Winnipeg and actually started his own architectural partnership here. But the government refused to allow either Simon or Boddington at first to be the supervising architect. Instead, they turned to a provincial architect. But this was part of a plot to divert money for the construction of the legislature directly into Conservative Party funds. And it turned into quite a big scandal. Then Premier Rodman Roblin actually resigned as a result of it. So after this, then Simon was able to come back and take on the role of supervising architect, but Boddington enlisted in the Canadian Army to take part in World War I. So what I want to point out here is that throughout all parts of this narrative about the building itself, so many levels of British settler colonialism are involved at just about every turn. Now let's talk about Frank Worthington Simon, who was the senior architect of the pair. He had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and the training at this school was particularly focused on classical Greek and Roman architectural models. And so Simon, of course, was working in the early years of the 20th century when this style had become immensely popular around the world. And so we can see this style in his own design for the Liverpool Cotton Exchange from 1907 in the image I've given you here. We see a big grand building, lots of classical references, hugely ornate, designed for grandiosity. But we also see it in examples from around the world from that same period, those first couple of decades of the 20th century. So I've given you some examples. I've given you the Grand Palais from Paris in 1900, the New York Public Library from 1911, the Palace of the Argentine National Congress from 1900, and then the Kobe Yusen building in 1918. And we see in all of these buildings, right, those classical references and lots of grandiosity. One thing I want to point out is that we tend to see these buildings either in European nations that are colonial powers or in places that have some connection to colonization. So even in Kobe, for example, even though that's in Japan, which was not colonized by a European power, Kobe is a port city and there would be lots of interactions with European, not settlers, but European traders in Kobe. Now, basically what we see is that Beaux-Arts architecture is using references again to Greek and Roman architecture, but it's all mixed up. So it's not anything, or not anything is meant to be purely Roman or purely Greek. It's mixed up and then kind of viewed through a Renaissance lens, which gives us this heavy decoration. Again, always with a view to grandiosity. So at the same time as all those buildings are going up around the world, two other Beaux-Arts styles legislatures were also under construction on the prairies. So we see the Saskatchewan Legislative Building from 1912 and the Alberta Legislative Building from 1913. So it's pretty safe to say that this style wasn't unique for its time in any way, the style of the Manitoba Legislative Building, but it wasn't even unique on the prairies. I mean, these look very similar to the Manitoba Legislative Building. And in fact, Beaux-Arts architecture wasn't even particularly unique in Winnipeg at that time. It features a variety of buildings from the very same period in the Beaux-Arts style. So the examples I've given you here from the top left are Union Station, built in 1911, just down Broadway from the legislature, the Niganon Center, which used to be the CPR station from 1905, the Bank of Montreal from 1910, which is in the center of our city at Portage in Maine, which has been purchased recently by the Manitoba Métis Federation. And then the Millennium Center, which used to be the Bank of Commerce, built in 1912. So we see all of these kinds of classicizing Beaux-Arts features throughout Winnipeg already. And we even see it in domestic architecture of the period. So it's basically any significant building erected between 1900 to 1920 will have some kind of features designed to recall the classical world. Okay, so why is this the case? Well, this is the period when the railways had recently been completed and connected across Canada. So by the end of the 19th century, Winnipeg was the chief economic center on the prairies. It's sitting at the very center of the rail network. Although as the 20th century dawned, other prairie cities were starting to catch up. It was a center of finance, and it was the center of the grain trade. So effectively, for its settler population, Winnipeg was a boom town. And the settler population was, for the most part, quite optimistic about its economic and cultural future. So it wanted to present itself as the peer of larger cities, kind of like Chicago. So that's when we start to see that nickname Chicago of the North be used about Winnipeg. But at the same time, cities like Winnipeg were also perceived as a frontier of sorts, both by residents of Winnipeg and those from kind of back east, right? So from Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal. And the local government and the railroads in particular were anxious to bring in more European settlers to the prairies. There had been quite a rush of immigration in the 1870s from European communities, but then in the 1880s and the 1890s, it started to slow down. So this classicizing architecture, like the Beaux-Arts examples that I've shown you here, was commonly used then at the sort of end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, to reinforce these connections to European aesthetics and culture, and sort of in a nouveau riche fashion as well, in newly wealthy areas. And that's not dissimilar to the image I gave you of the New York Public Library or that building from Kobe. But returning to North America, specifically here in North America, and especially in the Midwest and on the prairies, a lot of the classicizing architecture that we see is a response to the World's Fair that was held in Chicago in 1893 and its so-called White City. And so here I'm working with Rebecca Futo Kennedy's work on this event and its connections to white supremacy. And so the White City and the Chicago World's Fair then also spurred on a movement called the City Beautiful movement. So I'm going to talk about both of those before we get back to thinking about the legislative building. So the 1893 World's Fair was also known as the Columbian Exposition, and it was intended to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival on this side of the Atlantic by showcasing recent scientific and technological developments. So the fairground and its buildings were designed as an ideal prototype of a city following these Beaux-Arts principles, and of course featuring neoclassical architecture that was mostly covered in a white gypsum mixture, hence the nickname, the White City. And so I've given you an image on the right here from one of the sort of major buildings of the White City. This is the administration building and the Grand Court, and you can see the whiteness of the buildings. Throughout the White City were a set of classicizing sculptures meant to reinforce the connections between antiquity and present-day America. So we can see just almost in the center of this image, there's a tall column with a sculpture on top, and you'll notice that the buildings are also covered themselves in sculpture. Okay, so I'd like to pause here because I cannot emphasize enough what a colonial event this particular World's Fair was. The Columbus Day holiday was proposed to allow people to attend the fair. The Pledge of Allegiance made its debut there. But notably, like many similar exhibitions at the time, the exhibitions of various cultures and various innovations from around the world featured really white European cultures, and the non-white cultures were kept out of the main exhibition, out of this White City in Chicago. So in Chicago, these groups were found separately. They were in an area known as the Midway. So as people who've gone to the Red River X, we think of the Midway as where you find the Ferris wheel and the rides, which were also there in Chicago. But in addition to this, you could find an elaborate set of so-called ethnic villages with inhabitants dressed in traditional attire. So the image I've given you here is titled In the Eskimo Village, and this is an example of what you might find there. Now, the people in the so-called ethnic villages would both recreate culturally significant performances for fairgoers, but they also offered, their onlookers kind of an opportunity to observe them going about their exoticized everyday routine. So there's a real dynamic of who's doing the watching and who's there to be on display. And so that's why one of the more common terms for such exhibits is a human zoo, right? And I think that really is really expresses that dynamic of who's an exhibit and who's doing the watching. If we think about Indigenous peoples of North America, only a few of them were featured here. And of course, they would not be found anywhere near those neoclassical buildings, but they were in the reconstructions of traditional homes, as well as a model Indian school hosting delegations of Indigenous students for weeks at a time. And again, for presumably white fairgoers to come and observe. So as Rebecca Futo Kennedy has said, this event and the way that white supremacy was paired to classical imagery and architecture, quote, recruited white Americans on a journey to a great white utopia. And when she talks about this, she makes a very important point that I'm going to return to later in talking about the Manitoba Legislative Building, that the utopia of the white city wasn't just an elite space, but it was also aimed at the kind of average working class white American. And so I'm going to illustrate this further by showing you the agriculture building from the Chicago World's Fair. And it was built to exhibit all kinds of agricultural products that would be familiar to many Americans. So we look at the building, it's got that big, colonnade in the front, heavily sculpted pediment. It's got those sculptures on top and all over the building. If we look at the map of its exhibits inside, we see things like beer, macaroni, pickles, canned goods, right? So what it's actually exhibiting is not dissimilar to what you might find at your county or state fair, but it's been made into this grandiose space to align these values with the white working class, right? And to make the working class sort of familiar with this elevated classical past and invite them into it. And again, I want to be clear that it is a specific vision of who is in that working class as well. So this World's Fair, and more specifically its White City, ushered in a philosophy that combined architecture and urban planning known as the City Beautiful movement. And this involved introducing monumental architecture and monuments into North American cities. And the intent was to beautify them, but also to inculcate a kind of civic virtue among their populations, that space and imagery will inculcate certain values into the people who are using and seeing them. So the White City in Chicago was considered the first example of the City Beautiful. And this is an image of a grand city that is modern, but also features no visible poverty. And so this idea took off in many North American cities over the next 20 years. And in fact, it was internationally influential. So Canberra in Australia was designed around City Beautiful principles. And of course, the architecture in the City Beautiful is of course meant to be Beaux-Arts classicizing architecture. So I've given you a couple of examples. This is the National Mall in Washington, D.C., when it was redesigned in 1902 following the City Beautiful ideas. But we also have some of this here in Canada. So for example, we have Wascana Centre Park in Saskatchewan, in Regina, which is meant to be sort of the setting, and then the centerpiece is the Saskatchewan Legislature. And if we think about Broadway, which goes past our legislature and down to that train station, to Union Station, we also have some examples of this here. Pardon me. So in 1911, at the height of these trends in North American architecture and in urban planning, to propose a building on the scale and in the style of the current Manitoba Legislative Assembly was not only likely, but it was also incredibly commonplace, and especially in places like Winnipeg that were keen to self-fashion images of prosperity and virtue. So going back to the City Beautiful idea, the original plans also included a wide boulevard, and part of this became Memorial Boulevard that would lead all the way up to Ellis, which is about a block from where I'm sitting right now, with a large stone city hall that was designed based on Buckingham Palace that was supposed to be opposite the legislative building. And this never quite worked out because of the location of the current bay, or what was the bay, because you'll notice if we were to walk out and look down Memorial, that it's not quite straight to the legislature. It's not quite at a 90-degree angle from the front of the legislature. And it also was very expensive to complete all of this. And as you know, the building itself was so expensive, there was not a lot of cash left over. Okay, so let's really focus now on the legislative building. And so now I'm going to show you a few images of the legislative building as it was under construction, because I want to give you a sense of the scale of the building in that era, right? The Winnipeg of that era, and what a massive and expensive undertaking it was, particularly if we think about World War I happening in the background for much of its construction. So here I've given you an image of the second legislative building in front, and then the current one in the background being built. You can see how much bigger it is. And I want to point out that in front of the second legislative building, there sits that Queen Victoria statue, which was put in place, I think, in 1904. I also wanted to show you the kinds of technologies available to the people building this building. So you can see there's still draft horses moving much of the stone, moving a lot of the concrete and materials for building it. And then the image that I've given you at the bottom right here is facing north. So you can just see how small the buildings in the Winnipeg of that time are in comparison to this massive undertaking. And then finally, here is an image of the workers on the building with Frank Worthington Simon in the front there. He's underlined in yellow, and he's the fellow, I believe he has a walking stick and his hat on his lap. And then another image of workers up on top of the building looking over the skyline of Winnipeg, again, to show you how much taller this building was than all the other buildings in Winnipeg at that time. So just a massive, massive undertaking. Okay, well, now that I hopefully understand the context in which the legislature was built and why it features so many of these classicizing details, now we're going to look more closely at those details and then the image of Manitoba that Frank Worthington Simon and the builders of this building were trying to fashion through those classical details. So I'll start with a brief overview of the major classicizing features on the exterior, and then I'm going to focus on two specific sculptural choices that really reveal that narrative, that very specific narrative of Manitoba and its foundation and future. Oh, pardon me. Okay, there we go. Now, if we just look at the building as it stands today, we see all kinds of those Beaux-Arts features in the overall design. So we can see it looks like it's up on a podium. It's got a raised first story. The grand entrance features Ionic columns. So the columns that have those two little curly volutes at the top. At top of those columns, we have the triangular pediment with an elaborate set of sculptures. And we've got more statuary on the building, often placed in groups that highlight specific themes. And then there's an overall emphasis on symmetry. So we see those same basic features repeated on each side of the building. And then the other thing is that often with the sculptures, we see corresponding sculptures on the opposite side of the building. So let's look at those sculptures. The sculptures that we find on the exterior of the building include a pair of sphinxes on either side of the north pediment. So I mentioned that Beaux-Arts architecture kind of jumbles up Greek and Roman references. Well, this one also throws in a bit of Egypt too, but just those general sort of ancient world references. At the base of the dome, there are 4 statues that are allegories of art, agriculture, science, and industry. So agriculture I've given you here in place up by the dome, and you can see all those sheaves of wheat that are meant to represent the fruits of agricultural labor. I've given you an image of the statue grouping of art when it was sitting down in the yard of the legislature before it was hoisted into place. And this gives you a sense, because the sculptures are beside it, of just how big this sculpture was. I also have not great images of science and industry. They come from this 1925 guidebook to the legislature, so I apologize for the quality. But again, we see more of that allegory. The figures are dressed in kind of classicizing drapery and clothing, and lots of emphasis on the economy and industry. Now, above the east and west entrances to the building are 2 pairs of figures, and each of them are arranged so that you have a figure kneeling on either side of a large chest. Those on the west side are 2 female figures in an allegory of peace. They're kind of more generically classicizing. Again, they've got kind of drapery over them. The chest, though, is topped by a crown. And if you look at the crown carefully, it resembles some of the crowns in the British crown jewels. So presumably it's signifying the pacifying effect of British rule. Now, over on the west side, we have, the east side, we have 2 male figures in a similar pose to those 2 women that we just saw, and they signify war. There's the drum and trumpets on top of the chest, of course, instruments of war. And the 2 figures are a little bit more distinct than our more generic female figures. The one on the right is meant to be a Roman soldier of some kind, and then the one on the left is an Indigenous figure with a war bonnet. And I'm going to return to him in a bit, so just kind of hang on to this image. Now, these are not classical sculptures, but they were part of the overall design, and they fit into this sort of narrative that the building is telling. On the east and west entrances, we have statues of men who were thought to be heroes of Canadian Manitoba history, but especially as explorers and colonizers. So we have General Wolfe in the top right, top left, pardon me. the British victor at the Plains of Abraham, who defeated the French. We have Sieur de la Vérendrye, one of the first European explorers to go west of Lake Superior. Lord Dufferin, who was a Governor General of Canada, and he's the one who came to Manitoba in the late 1800s. He's the one who gave it the nickname the Keystone Province. And then Lord Selkirk, who is a local colonial figure. He brought a lot of Scottish settlers into Treaty 1 territory. Okay, so finally, on top of the whole building, we find the famous Golden Boy, who is more formally known as as Eternal Youth and the Spirit of Enterprise. So he was created by this French sculptor Georges Gardet under strict instructions from Frank Worthington Simon. So all of these sculptures were, influenced or informed or directly designed by Simon. Now, as we can see from the image I've given you here on the right, the Golden Boy is based on John Bologna's 16th century bronze of the Roman god Mercury, who is, of course, a god of business and commerce. So he was hoisted into place in 1919 as the finishing touch on the building. And he symbolizes Manitoba's economy and prospects, carrying his sheaf of wheat. Those are those fruits of agricultural labor again. He's got a torch to call the youth to an eternal pursuit of economic prosperity, and he faces the north of the province because of its abundance of natural resources. Okay, now I want to turn to the pediment, and this is where we're really going to dive into some detail. This is the portion of the exterior that tells the most elaborate narrative. It offers an account of Manitoba's place within Canada and the formation of the province. So according to a 1925 guidebook to the legislative building, the sculptures on the pediment symbolize, quote, an ideal on which a nation is being built and embraces the whole of the Dominion of Canada, even as all Canadians should do in thought and action if we purpose to grow as a nation. So this pediment, in representing a narrative of Manitoba and mythologizing the origins of the province, follows in the tradition of temples like the Parthenon from classical Athens. And of course, the Parthenon, for someone like Frank Worthington Simon, familiar with the canon of classical architecture, this is, perhaps the most classical or canonical classical building. So it's not unusual to find this on Greek temples, the sculpture that offers a story about the place, but also an identity to the inhabitants of that place. So these are reconstructions of the pediments of the classical Parthenon. And on the bottom, we see the story of the birth of Athena, who is the tutelary deity of Athens. Up above, we see the story of Athena giving the gift of the olive tree to Athens. So again, a story about Athens and Athenians and expressing some Athenian values. Now, if we pay close attention from an art historical perspective, we want to look at the style of sculpture, like the details of the fabric draped on the human figures, the poses of the figures, and the musculature, because we're going to see that when we go back to the pediment of the Manitoba Legislative Building. And I want to really emphasize that the Parthenon was also built at a time when Athens was thinking of itself as powerful and prosperous. So just like Manitoba and Winnipeg were thinking of themselves as the Legislative Assembly was being built. And so these images, right, on this building, which was the center of Athens' most important civic cult, are doing this very similar type of self-fashioning that we then find on the Legislative Building here in Manitoba. So let's return to this pediment and I'll give you a little tour of it. On the far left of the pediment is a ship's wheel symbolizing the Atlantic Ocean. And beside that, we have a reclining figure known as the Contented Man, also known as the Indolent Man sometimes. The female figure beside him is the Spirit of Progress, and we see her beckoning him towards Manitoba in the center. And then next to him, we see a bull led by a young woman. So to classicists, that's immediately recognizable as Europa and the bull. And I'll return to that myth shortly. Nestled in between Europa and Manitoba are the man, woman, and child that are identified by the same 1925 guidebook as a, quote, vital unit in the social structure. And they're really meant to be sort of a European settler family. Now, if we move on to the other side of the pediment, on the far right, we see two figures entwined with an urn of water flowing out of it. And they're personifications of the Red and Assiniboine Rivers, and then the way they join at the forks. And then we have that little trident that indicates the Pacific Ocean. Next to the rivers, a man works the earth with a plow and horses to symbolize cultivation and, of course, agriculture. And finally, next to him, a man and a woman deliver the bounty of agriculture to Manitoba herself. So let's look at Manitoba, and we'll see some of these references really coming into play. In the center, we have our central female figure representing Manitoba. If you look closely under the image on the right, you can just see the top of the word peeking out. And she's got the rays of the sun behind her, and she's dressed in military garb. So our first sort of thought with Manitoba being part of Canada, part of the British Empire, this is connecting her to Britannia, right? The personification of Britain. But also Britannia is also connected to the goddess Athena, especially the helmet. And this helmet, you'll notice, has a triple crest, right? And so this is similar to the one that we believe was on the statue of the Athena Parthenos that stood in the Parthenon in Athens during the classical period. And I've given you at the bottom here a reconstruction from the Roman period of that statue, so you can see the triple crest. But we've got to keep mixing up her Greco-Roman references. So across her lap, she holds the Roman fasces across her lap, which are symbolizing governmental authority. So now we have a basic narrative. We have European settlement and agricultural dominance over the land, leading to the prosperity and strong government of Manitoba. Or, as that 1925 guide to the building tells us, and it tells us this in all caps, quote, "This building stands as a symbol of faith and belief in the future greatness of the Great West." And for Manitobans who are listening today, that Great West will be familiar to you because of Great West Life, probably, an insurance company whose head office stands across the street from the legislative building. But that's a phrase used very commonly in the rhetoric around the opening up of the American West and the Canadian prairies to European settlement. But I want to go back and kind of interrogate the narrative of the pediment a bit more to think about what's represented here, but also what isn't represented here, or in fact, almost anywhere else on the exterior. So we'll start by looking at that image of Europa and the bull. So in myth, Europa is abducted by the god Zeus. He comes to her in the form of a tame bull and lures her onto his back. She's playing on a beach. And then once she's on his back, he swims away across the sea with her to Crete, where she bears him 3 notable sons who go on to become heroes and rulers. And so this seems like kind of like a straightforward tale, and it's very common to see images of Europa and the bull in lots of places in the modern world. So we see her on the €2 coin, just simply symbolizing Europe. But in Manitoba, for example, we can see her at Assiniboine Park. Leo Mull's sculpture in the sculpture garden is present there as well. So it seems kind of on its face, you know, like a bit of a fairy tale. But if we really look closely, it's a story of kidnapping and ultimately sexual assault. And this is something that even in Antiquity was acknowledged. So using Europa and the bull to symbolize the impact of European settlement on Manitoba is a kind of a muddled metaphor on one hand, and on the other hand, it's a little bit too on the nose. Okay, so let's go back to thinking about the pediment. So Europa is nestled between the spirit of progress and the family. And the plowman is in the corresponding position on the other side, thinking about these principles of symmetry. And here we're really emphasizing, again, European settlement of Manitoba. Other commentators from around that period of the building being built said the bull shows the virile settlement of Manitoba. But then paired with the plowman, of course, it's emphasizing the massive expansion of agriculture that had occurred in the decades prior to the construction of the legislative building. So this choice effectively erases the contributions of any other group to the foundation of the province and tells a story of noble, hardworking Europeans arriving to tame an empty wilderness through agricultural enterprise. And so I'm going to give you a fairly long quote from that 1925 guide that I think really illustrates this idea. So the guide says, quote, "A little more than 50 years ago, this whole country from the Great Lakes and out to the Pacific coast was nothing but a vast fur preserve. A few years ago, Rudyard Kipling visited Winnipeg and said, the visions that your old men saw years ago, I saw translated today into stone and brick and concrete." And the guidebook goes on to say, the people of this day are reaping what those pioneers, those dreamers, those men of vision saw and seeing worked to make their dreams come true, so that the doubters would be convinced and this country come to the fulfillment of its destiny and become, and again in all caps, the breadbasket of the world. That sounds like some pretty familiar rhetoric. I mean, that's not dissimilar to what Brian Pallister had to say. So again, going back to the pediment, including the contented man and the spirit of progress, has a very similar intent to the sculptures and architecture from the White City at the Chicago World's Fair in drawing these non-elite white settlers into a fantastical narrative of an empty land awaiting settler cultivation, which would lead it and them to civic glory. So in this pediment, we have what effectively amounts to a narrative of white supremacy that ignores any other presence in the area prior to European settlement. But I did mention that there is one Indigenous figure on the building. So here it is. And I want to point out that this Indigenous figure was the only Indigenous representation on the exterior of the legislative building or on the grounds until 1971, when a statue of Louis Riel was placed between the river and the building. So what amounts to the back of the building. This statue was very controversial and was replaced later with a different statue of Louis Riel. Now let's look at this Indigenous figure alongside the Roman soldier depicting war. So as far as I can tell, this is a very generic depiction. It corresponds more to a romanticized image of indigeneity than any specific local First Nation. And placing this image alongside one of a Roman soldier suggests that Indigenous people are equally distant and equally mythologized, and that they are no more a presence in Manitoba's vision of itself than an ancient Roman might be. And so the first time I really noticed this sculpture in its context, I immediately thought of the author Thomas King's concept of the dead Indian, what he calls the dead Indian. And this is a term that he uses for what he calls the stereotypes and cliches that North America has conjured up out of its collective imaginings and fears. So that is to say, when he refers to this idea of the dead Indian, he's thinking about the kinds of Indigenous figures that we see in advertising. You think of the Land O'Lakes labels in place names, in Westerns, and all kinds of media. So where might this kind of romanticized idea of indigeneity come from in Winnipeg at the beginning of the 20th century when this building is being built? Because it's not just that Frank Worthington Simon is importing this from the British context. Well, it's present in Winnipeg at this time too. So let me just show you an image from the Winnipeg Stampede of 1913. It's labeled Indian War Dance. And if we look closely at the image, we see, of course, in the center, this group of Indigenous people who are dressed in traditional clothing, performing something for onlookers. And if we look closely, the onlookers that are in the back are white men in suits. And then if we look behind them in the distant background, we see a neoclassical colonnade and a building with neoclassical facade there. So this is something that was certainly present in Winnipeg in 1913 when the building was being built. But when we think about this idea carved in stone, we want to maybe also think back to another set of sculptures from the Parthenon. And these are the Metapees. The Metapees are kind of square carvings, and they go all the way around the exterior of the building and often tell a narrative. The Metapees on the Parthenon depict 4 wars. They depict the Centaurs versus the Lapids, the Trojan War, the Gigantomachy, so the war against the giants, and the Amazonomachy, the war against the Amazons. And I cannot sort of emphasize enough how well Simon would have known the Parthenon, known its sculptures. By the time Simon was training as an architect, these would have been present in the British Museum. He's almost certain to have actually seen the Metapees I have on this image for you. So he would have known these kinds of things and have studied them very well. So of course, the theme in these images from the Parthenon is war, but it's war against mythologized others. And most of these mythologized others, the centaurs, the Amazons, the giants, are representing a lack of civilization and chaos. And that's really meant to be for an Athenian viewer, contrasted with the orderly, civilized Athenians themselves. So I don't think, in light of all this, that we can read that Indigenous figure without first contrasting it to the image of peace on the west side of the building, and then thinking through the narrative of European settlement presented in the pediment. All of the images that I've shown you today were chosen with great care and a deep, deep knowledge of the canon of classical art and architecture. And they were chosen with very clear political purposes. Frank Worthington Simon and the sculptors that he was directing were working in the idiom of the Beaux-Arts movement that was so popular at the time, and using it with this message of nostalgia. But like all nostalgia, it's jumbled up and romanticized, right? It's not for a vision of antiquity that had ever really existed. And in turn, they took that nostalgia and used it to conjure up an image of Manitoba as the center of a powerful colonial enterprise. So this nostalgia is both looking backwards, but also sort of looking forwards at the same time. So now, in this moment in 2021, as it becomes clearer every day that that image of antiquity never existed and that image of Manitoba never really existed, and that nostalgia for both of those times is misplaced at best and actively harmful at worst, we urgently need to question that narrative rather than repeating it unquestioningly, as we saw with Brian Pallister's comments. We need to consider why a building that is meant to be the assembly of the people of Manitoba features Europa and European settlers front and center, while the lone Indigenous figure is mythologized, associated with war, and relegated to the side. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Funke. What a great talk. I was, my head is spinning a bit in terms of connecting, from Brian Pallister's comments this past summer to, well, I would never have thought to connect Brian Pallister and the Parthenon, but Brian Pallister's comments this past summer to the Parthenon, to its, buildings. And I think it was great how you focused on his comment on building. How buildings create and reinforce identities, but how these giant monuments can also act as places of erasure, not only creation. I think you really put that out to us very clearly. I should have said at the beginning to those watching that if you'd like to ask a question of Dr. Funke, you can put it into the chat, or you can use the Q&A button at I think it's in the middle of the screen at the bottom. You can put your question in there, and then I'll read it aloud. Maybe while people are sort of like me, kind of recovering from the geographical and temporal breadth of topics that you dealt with, and really connected in this incredible persuasive argument, I might ask a question that occurred to me, and maybe it's obvious, but I sort of wondered, as you were, you began by talking about the Beaux-Arts movement and these neoclassical buildings as part of the City Beautiful, and connected it with the Columbian Exposition, and I followed that completely. And then I wondered, though, do you think that this kind of, is this a kind of particularly Canadian classical reception that we're seeing in the Manitoba legislature? I mean, do we see this kind of imagery on Beaux-Arts architecture across North America, or is this something that you think is particular to the Canadian reception of this sort of style? Mm-hmm.
So I think this is part of the next step of this project. Is I want to look more closely, for example, at remember the picture of the building, the agriculture building from the Chicago World's Fair, and it has clearly some kind of allegorical sculpture in its pediment. So I'd like to see what kind of a narrative that is telling. But then I also would like to compare to the Alberta and Saskatchewan legislative buildings too, because they are two perfectly similar, of course, to our legislative building, to see what is particularly sort of Canadian or perhaps prairie, Western Canadian about this. Certainly, I would say there is a real emphasis on British settlement, right? So we've got, I don't think I have an image, but often you'll see in some of the carved stone balustrades, it's effectively the Union Jack motif repeated. The image of Manitoba, who is effectively Britannia and effectively Athena at the same time. So I really think this strong connection, and keeping in mind, of course, that World War I is happening at this time. Canada's self-image was very much tied to Britain. I mean, it still is in some ways, but it was very much tied to Britain at this time. So I think, I suspect that there is something that is specifically Canadian. But also, I suspect there's a little bit more that's specifically prairie. And we see that especially with the agriculture, all the sheaves of wheat everywhere. But we also see that with those four statues at the base of the east and west entrances, right? Not Wolfe, but when we have Selkirk and Dufferin and Varennes all together, that's a very clear narrative of settling and exploring from Europeans, that is.
Great, thank you. Well, I have a million other questions, but I have the privilege of going down the hall for me. I'm just going to look. There are dozens of comments, most of which are saying thank you to you, but I do note One question within the chat from David Meadows asking about the statue. Where did it go? Sorry, the statue of General Wolfe. Where is the statue of General Wolfe in relation to the other classical aspects of the building, I guess?
So those four statues are at the base. They're right on the ground by the entrance, or they're up on plinths by the entrances on the east and west sides. So the side with the pediment that I've been talking about so much with those big Ionic columns is facing north. Right, so that's facing towards University of Winnipeg for Winnipeggers who are kind of trying to orient themselves here. And then those are on the east and west. And I'd have to go back and kind of double check which ones are underneath the images of peace and which ones are underneath the images of war. I don't think there's a connection, but you know, there's so much detail in this building and it's so thoughtfully, it's designed with so much intention that, you know, I think we almost can't not read intention into all the choices of placement. So I'd have to go double check.
Okay, more questions. So from Sheila Miller, my mom. Melissa, great talk. She's wondering if there were any Indigenous people involved in the building of the legislature.
Not as far as I know. And even when we go back to some of those images, I mean, presumably there might have been Indigenous people who are part of the workforce. But this was very clearly designed to bring in, as I said, it was for members of the British Empire, citizens of the British Empire, however we want to define that, to design, right? And the person who chose the winning design was the head of a British Association of Architects. So not that I know of, and I certainly don't think that in Manitoba in 1911, that there probably was any effort to reach out to Indigenous leaders or anything to offer input on the building.
But if anything, an assimilationist kind of ideology would have been happening.
Yes, yeah. So I think, yeah, certainly if anything's available, it would be assimilation.
Another question here from Yusuf Taguri. I've heard on several occasions the chest depicted alongside the statue of the two warriors above the west entrance is supposed to represent the Ark of the Covenant. Is there any truth to that? And if so, what is it meant to symbolize? Perhaps something along the lines of religious justification for European settlement?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's one of the things that has been talked about a lot in terms of thinking through all the references, both within and without the building. Absolutely. And I think the sort of, again, it goes back to all those like kind of jumbled up references to the ancient world. And there are a few more biblical references on the interior as well that were sort of designed by Simon. So it certainly wouldn't surprise me if that was some kind of again, like a religious justification for these things, because certainly when we're thinking about this depiction of European settlers and Europeanizing and classicizing imagery, so certainly that's very much a Christian ideal, right? That's also connected. And all of those things are kind of, again, they're sort of mashed in together into these ideas.
Okay, a couple questions from the Q&A part here. So one of them is, the first one, sorry, is, I am not sure if I missed this, but why is there so much reference to the ancient Greek world in the legislature? So in terms of why is ancient Greece and Rome, and as you said, other jumbled parts of the ancient world there?
Well, this goes back to that idea of the Beaux-Arts, right? And then it's this kind of nostalgia in a way for these ancient cultures that at this time, or at that time, I should say, represented imperialism, represented things that were considered to be positive values at that time by people who are building giant monuments, right? And so it's really kind of what I would call it a misguided nostalgia. We want something that ties us not only to European culture and aesthetics, it makes us look like we're one of the big boys, right? We can keep up to cities like Chicago with these big monuments. And again, the classical references then also express those values of imperialism and colonization, really.
Great, lots of questions. It's hard for me to keep up with them. So I apologize to anyone who's asking questions and I'm missing them, but I'm just trying to go through them as I saw them appear. So next question is asking for your thoughts, Melissa. What are your own thoughts? This is a big question on the toppling of the statues.
Ooh, that's a big question. Okay, so I'm going to use a classical reference to explain my thoughts on this. In ancient Rome, there is a concept called Damnatio Memoriae. And the way I'm going to talk about it is not necessarily exactly how it was practiced, but basically, if there's someone who you think, no longer corresponds to the values of current society, And seriously enough, you can go and erase their name off of monuments, you can take their statues down, or you can put a different head on, you can do all kinds of things to them. But basically what that says is this no longer accords with our current values. And so what's happening when these statues are coming down is there is a group of people who I think for very good reasons are saying this symbolizes something. Think about to those comments of Belinda Vandenbroek that I shared at the beginning. This no longer is a narrative or a value that I can support or be part of. And so that's an expression of some pretty intense anger for very justified reasons. And it's a statue. It's not a human being. It's not a child.
Great, thanks so much. And Haptom Marizi asks, would there be an appropriate figure to represent Indigenous people rather than the romanticized version, or perhaps no representation at all with regards to the sculpture? So another asking.
You guys are giving me the tough questions. I think that when any of these, I mean, we've been expressing ourselves with statues for a very long time, right? And it's complicated and it doesn't seem to really be reflecting our values. So maybe we could even think about memorializing, remembering, talking about our values, commemorating them in a different way, right? Statues, that's like an old Greek and Roman way. On the other hand, if we really insist on this, I don't think it's something that can be led. It should be led by members of the Indigenous community. And it should be through with their permission and with their ideas.
Yeah, it makes me think of a talk we had a couple of years ago in the long ago pre-COVID past with Dr. Matthew Sears, who gave a talk to us about the history of this representation and memorializing people with monuments and tracing it back to the Greeks and Romans, and also to maybe some right-wing and very ideologically charged, let's say, modern ideas.
Well, I think monuments are fundamentally, again, part of nostalgia. Right. And as I mentioned earlier, and I work on this in other contexts of the Greek and Roman world, nostalgia is not an accurate view of the past. I'll put it that way. It's a very romanticized view.
Absolutely. A question from our colleague here, Dr. Austin. Has there been any debate in the legislative chamber about confronting this imagery on the legislature? Parentheses, she asks this knowing current Manitoba politicians have not been able to agree on a land acknowledgement for the plants. So, as far as I know, there has not been any debate in the chamber about this. I do know that Wab Kinew, the leader of the local NDP, of the Manitoba NDP, is aware of the lack of Indigenous representation. He's commented on that before. But no, I don't think that it actually has made it onto the Legislative Assembly floor yet. And I think outside of the building, there's a plan to put up a statue of Chief Peguis on the ground, yes, but not the building itself. Yeah. So one thing I want to comment on too is that as Chief Peguis in particular is a name that pops up not necessarily in 1911 or 1913 or anything around this time, but a few decades later, people start saying, well, how come there's no statue of Chief Peguis? At least that's like the least you could do is kind of the rhetoric around his name. Right. And it's interesting that Louis Riel appears in 1871, I guess that centennial. There's a sort of ability to finally have a statue of him then. Our old friend, Dr. Sukava, tunes in from Delaware to ask us a question. I'm wondering whether you're familiar with any early initiatives for public tours to unlock the mysterious truths of the building's architecture when it first opened. I'm thinking specifically about the Hermetic Code tours that were occurring a while ago. And there's the book. And for those who aren't in Winnipeg, yes, there is a kind of Hermetic, I feel like it's a Da Vinci Code like sort of tour. I don't know. Okay, yes. So this book came out in 2007. It came out just after the Da Vinci Code was super popular, right? When everyone was talking about the Da Vinci Code. And so, yes, I'm very familiar. I've read the Hermetic Code. I think one of the things that my response to that is, of course, these kinds of buildings are like playgrounds for people like Frank Worthington Simon to insert as much symbolism as he can. And everyone who's involved in the building of these buildings really kind of pushes that and really wants that to happen. But I think when we're so busy looking for a secret code that the building is offering, that we miss the obvious code that they wanted people to see. And so just like that, Rebecca Futo Kennedy's comments on the White City, right, that it's this kind of recruitment almost of working class white settlers into these ideals, right? That if we're so busy looking for like Masonic codes, that we're missing these obvious images that are telling us a very clear narrative, and we're intended to do so as well. Great, thank you. For those who are, there's lots of questions. We're going to run out of time, I think, before. So just to let you know, I am privileging those that I know belong to students. So sorry if
I'm also happy to answer questions by email as well. Yeah.
So a question from Julia Stern. Do you think that it's being inspired in some ways, not directly by classics, but by others being inspired by classics, that causes some disconnect between our legislature and classics more so than something like the White City at the World's Fair?
Okay, Julie, I'm gonna reread your question just to make sure that I'm getting it right. So it's sort of like these references are sort of out there and people are seeing the references, but maybe not actually thinking all the way back to the Parthenon, for example. Is that maybe what you're getting at? So I do think that there is kind of, yeah, a bit of disconnect, right, between the actual things that are inspiring this building, right? And we sort of just we slot it into like, oh, it's like the Bank of Montreal, it's got big columns. It's like the Millennium Center, it's got those big columns, or it's like the train station. And we kind of think, okay, it's just classicizing, it's sort of monumental and trying to be grand and all that. But I think, again, that someone like Frank Worthington Simon would know these things so well and would want people to know that he knew them as well, right? He's not trying to be secret about this. He wants people to see this and wants people to be influenced. And he, in fact, has comments on in some of his work or some of his writings where he talks about how he wants architecture to be something that improves people, and that by looking at it and by taking part in it makes them kind of want to be part of this image that he's offering of Manitoba. Now, at the same time, there are also other people who weren't big fans of the building in Manitoba at the time. And so there are like newspaper editorials saying, well, what are the MLAs supposed to wear togas or something? So to them, they're kind of, they're seeing the classical references on the face and not maybe reading as deeply into them.
And Julia's question makes me, think about the layers of reception. The reception is an ongoing process. And so you can trace it right back to the Parthenon, or you can also trace it to the neoclassical movement, the Renaissance, and so many places in between. Meaning.
Yeah, and this is definitely, the Renaissance lens is part of the Beaux-Arts movement. Absolutely.
A question from Marina Milne. I was just wondering, are you aware of any past or recent attempts from the provincial government? This is maybe we've sort of covered this ground, to acknowledge the colonial narratives present in the interior design. Yeah.
So again, there's that statue of Chief Peguis is supposed to be coming, but I do think this is something that there should be some attention paid to it, and I especially think that sort of narrative of Europa and the bull, is not representative of Manitoba. It's not representative of us in 2021, and it wasn't representative of us at any point. So something I think does need some rethinking.
A question from Alan here. Why is there such an emphasis on Greek and Roman culture in British imperialism? A big question, metaphorically and in terms of recreating architectural styles.
Oh, okay. It's a great question. Because British imperialism at various times has taken on different kind of nostalgic images of the past. And so, for example, sometimes they want to call back to sort of more local, like King Arthur and that kind of thing, right? And then other times they want to take on this sort of Roman, it's almost like they're the next Roman Empire. But again, in keeping with this idea of nostalgia, it's always just really muddy. They're not looking clearly, and perhaps when you're trying to create this image, you don't want to get right down to the nuts and bolts of the reality of what was happening at those times. But it's always kind of a muddy and muddled image of the past that they're drawing on. But certainly, trying to align themselves with something like the Roman Empire, and then of course a little soupçon of Greece thrown in too, for good measure.
And a question, I think it's sort of picking up on something you just mentioned about MLAs wearing togas, an image that's going to stay with me. Professor McKinnon, was there any public backlash to the images, notably, yes, those depicting nudity and muscular women, etc., things that might not be so appropriate in a conservative Manitoba culture of the early 20th century? Or today?
Yeah, that's a good question. As far as I know, people weren't too angry. Notice that the women, when you can see sort of they're naked from the waist up, tend to be really up high. Right? Queen Victoria is certainly covered, but so they're up high, they're harder to see actually from the ground or to notice those kinds of details. So I suspect even just the mechanics of looking at them affects that. but also a lot of the people who, again, who didn't like the building, they thought it was wasteful, they thought it was too expensive. They were like, why Greece and Rome in Manitoba, right? So even then people were questioning this aesthetic, even though it was so common and so mainstream. There were definitely people present in Manitoba at the time who really did not care for that. So I don't think it was anything too specific to like nudity or anything like that, or muscular women, but certainly just the overall idea of sort of this Greco-Roman building in Manitoba. It's not appropriate for us at all, right?
I wonder if the space makes a difference too, because I've looked at pulp magazines from the early 20th century that faced for showing pictures of classical statues like the Venus de Milo, but they're working class magazines, whereas this building kind of appropriate for these things somehow, and they're not going to be misused or abused by viewers or something like that.
That's right. It's meant to be elevated, right? And there's also, again, this idea of like of aligning those elevated principles with the working class too. So it's kind of like bringing them along for the ride as opposed to bringing it down to their level, right? And maybe a sense of like, well, if you cannot understand the allegory of my pediment, then we don't want you, right, as part of this anyways.
Yeah, and the buildings, of course, have the grandeur by having columns. Even if you don't understand it, you know it's supposed to be important.
Yes, exactly. You don't need to know a thing about orders of architecture or anything. You see those big columns, the buildings lifted up, and you kind of go, whoa, it's a huge building, right? And I mean, I was just there the other day looking up at it thinking, wow, this is a huge building, right? And even that, there's just kind of a response to that without knowing anything about the architecture.
Exactly. A question from our friend Dr. Bricky. This idea of a building as an allegory is fascinating to me. If allegory means to speak otherwise or something similar, I'm wondering how we might think again about that moment the statue comes down, as a refusal of these misrepresentations of poetry, imagery, and myth in the service of real oppression. This building stands in our city euphemistically poeticizing the past every day, and the flags that stand in place of Queen Victoria now seem so different representationally, not at all allegorical, each one counting one child lost.
I really like this because I've also been thinking about commemoration, right? And this idea of like, what do we do if we're not going to do it with statues? How do we commemorate? There's lots of ways to commemorate things. And in response, of course, to the children and the children's graves, the flags, if anyone has been there, it's a very stirring and emotional sight. And there's something about the animation of those as well, like the ribbons that we find on, for example, the Maryland Bridge. There are red ribbons signifying missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and two-spirit individuals. And there's something about the fact that they're animated. They're not carved in stone. They're not sitting there still. That really, I find particularly poignant, right? So I do think that there's some kind of a difference in this kind of commemoration that is animated, and it's something that changes over time and can be different from day to day when you go to see it, depending on like what the weather is, right? Whereas these things that are carved in stone are there and they're meant to be seen in this, basically in this one way, right?
It's interesting to think about the missing statue that way, because it's a monument now of like it's an accidental monument of an action rather than a monument of a time when people got together to decide to memorialize someone.
Exactly. Yes, it was a moment that happened quickly, right? And as opposed to this years-long planning process and a contest and all the rest.
I know there's a comment in the chat. I'm not sure if it's a question, but I think I'll bring it up anyways, from Travis Kohut. I do find it especially noteworthy that this classical architecture also erases the fur trade history and narrative of Manitoba, which was likely associated to the Métis, but is now one we celebrate as part of Manitoban and Canadian history, and that's its own form of erasure. Métis founded this province, and it has to be intentional to keep them and their history off the building, parentheses, especially no bison. And is that right? There are no bison on the building.
Not on the exterior. So you go in though, and the first thing you see, there's a staircase kind of moving up, and then there's the two bison, big bronze statues, sculpted by, I believe, the same sculptor who did the Golden Boy and the statues of Moses and Solon in the actual Legislative Assembly. So I haven't worked a lot on the interior yet, but I feel like there's a whole slew of references in there that I could deal with as well. But the bison is very interesting. There's a comment from, I want to say from the 1920s, and it was a couple from Nebraska on a car trip, and they'd come up to Manitoba. They came into the legislative building and were wowed by it. Then they were like, why are there two bison in a British building? And this goes back to that idea of British imperialism, right? What the heck are they doing in here? And everyone, the response is basically, well, we're in Manitoba. Yeah, there should be bison here. But it's interesting that they aren't on the outside,
Mm-hmm.
right? Whereas the bison, for example, in the Pediment, if that might be one of the first things that people would associate with Manitoba in its foundation, at least as a province, that is. So it's an interesting choice to put them inside, but not outside, right? All of these things are so allegorical on the exterior, with the exception of the 4 actual statues of the so-called heroes. Why no bison is beyond me. Yeah.
And maybe I'll give the last question looking to the future for my co-host Ruth. So Ruth, you don't have to type your question, you can just ask.
Well, I didn't want to interrupt. I want to say, first of all, that was fabulous. I really enjoyed the entire thing. And especially for anyone who knows me, you answered all the, who, what, why, when, where, and hows. And I think that's fabulous. I really enjoyed it. But did you mention early on that the Bank of Montreal building was purchased by the Métis? And or the community, and I was wondering if you've heard or if there's anything maybe in the future where they're thinking to change the look of that building to be more suited towards their own representation.
So I haven't heard about the plans for the exterior of the building. It's built kind of to be like a Roman basilica. It's got big Corinthian capitals, and the space inside is very large and imposing. I do know that they're going to use it as an interpretive center of some kind. That's as far as I know. And again, I think that'll come. It's still being used as the Bank of Montreal, I think. But I do think it's really appropriate that the Manitoba Métis Federation has bought this classicizing building that's at Portage in Maine. And Portage in Maine is, of course, where the ox carts, the Red River carts, would turn around, right? It's in such a key spot for settlers, but also for Métis culture and for the fur trade. It really is, to me, I really look forward to seeing what they do in that building. But I think the space is so symbolic and so meaningful. It's incredible.
Yeah, it'll be great to see what they do.
Train stations too, right? Exactly between the two of them.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth.
Well, I know I haven't got to everyone's questions, so I apologize, but I think we've had Dr. Funke talking for about 70 minutes, so time we say goodbye. I think she will indeed be happy to take questions via email. If I'm correct, Melissa, your is m.funke, F-U-K-E, at uwinnipeg.ca.
I'll put it in the chat.
And you can also find out by going to uwinnipeg.ca/classics to find Melissa's contact information. While you're at uwinnipeg.ca/classics, of course, you might stumble upon the New Directions in Classics tab on the left side of our website, and you'll discover that next Friday, in fact, less than 7 days from right now, at 3:30 p.m., we have our final talk of the fall of 2021, when our colleague here, Dr. Warren Heward, will give a talk entitled Heracles, Plato, and Philosophical Immortality. So if you're interested in learning how Plato and immortality might go together, with a picture of a wrestler on the front on the poster, so I'm particularly curious to see what happens. Tune in then. You can get the registration link by going to our website, uwinnipeg.ca/classics, or finding the myriad ways it'll be advertised on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or simply by emailing me at pj.miller@uwinnipeg.ca. This talk will be posted on YouTube by about Monday at 2 p.m. or so, give or take. So if you want to find it there, again, you can find the link through our website, and let others who may not have been here or revisit some of it. With that, it just falls to me to thank Dr. Funke for this brilliant talk that effectively connected ancient Athens to our well, I don't have anything to say. To the former Premier of Manitoba, Brian Pallister, the Athena Parthenon statue to the Progressive Conservatives, Europa to today's Manitoba, and really keyed down for us and identified how buildings both build narratives and build provinces, perhaps, but also erase the people and stories that were already there. So thanks so much, Dr. Funke, for joining us today. Thanks very much to audience members for sticking it out, and I hope you all have a very nice weekend. Thank you.